Yes, Anirban is a microbiologist by training, has been involved with scientific publishing for over 2 decades now. Um, he's written about a number of health-related topics, infectious diseases, cancer, neuroscience, everything. I've been following him, I know, for several years now on Twitter, where I remember he used to post frequently about his travels across the world, food, culture. Seems to be from a different life altogether, but that's the case. Over the last year, Anirban has stood out as the voice of reason and science, at least on Twitter. In the middle of the pandemic, he started a newsletter on Substack on the subject. Also written a book on the pandemic in the middle of the pandemic that hit the stands, hit the bookstores a few weeks back. And I'm sure he has a lot to offer on the subject that we are here going to discuss here today. So, welcome, Anirban. Thank you for doing this. And guys, before we start, please drop in your questions in the Q&A box, and we will take them through the course of this chat. Ashish, do you want to take the first question, or should I? Cool. So the first thing that I wanted to ask, right, and since we are going to discuss mutants and vaccines, I want to understand how common is this process of mutation among viruses, and what is the significance of it?
First of all, thank you, Pradip. Thank you, Ashish, for inviting me on the morning context. As you mentioned, Pradip, I've known you through Twitter for a good few years, where I maintained a semi-anonymous existence, traveling for work and also on vacation to various parts of the world. And some of my philosophical musings and some of my experiments and failed experiments in the kitchen mainly. I think when the pandemic started last year, even before that, I think in early January, when reports were coming out of Wuhan, I shifted gears a little bit and decided that I was going to write a little bit more about what was going on. And then, as you mentioned, I did write a book during this entire process. So that book is COVID-19 Separating Fact from Fiction. As you mentioned, it's out and available in India. A lot of what we're going to discuss is, I would say, is explained in perhaps detail in that book with respect to infections and mutations and things like that. Obviously, the hot topic right now is the specifics around the variants that we have in the vaccines. But in short, all viruses mutate. Actually, all forms of life mutate, even we mutate. And in our bodies, when mutations happen to certain kinds of cells and they continue to proliferate, that's when cancers happen. Mutations are a cause of a lot of the variation that happens in the world. And viruses, because they are not cellular, they are almost like chemical particles, they have to spread in very large numbers. So they create large number of copies. Whenever they create copies, they make mistakes. So mutations is basically a fancy scientific word for a change or a mistake. Now, most mistakes in these cases are of no significance or can even be detrimental. However, some mistakes, when they happen, do confer some sort of advantage to the virus in terms of it either being able to spread or create more copies of itself and things like that. So those are the mutations that tend to be maintained. So ultimately, viruses mutate because these mistakes happen. RNA viruses like the coronavirus tend to mutate more because the copier that they have is a very sloppy copier. It's not a very high fidelity copier. And the reason that they have RNA and we have DNA is actually better suited for complex organisms like ourselves. Like RNA has been relegated to secondary functions in the human body because it's not a great molecule for creating complex organisms and multicellular organisms even. Because if you had a lot of mistakes, then you wouldn't be able to have complex organisms. So mutations are fairly frequent, especially in RNA viruses. Coronaviruses, believe it or not, are actually not the fastest mutating type of RNA virus. There are other RNA viruses, even polio viruses, that can mutate pretty fast. Just to give you an example, the difference between some types of primates like chimpanzees and humans is about 2% of our genetic material. That's our DNA. In an RNA virus, and that's taken like millions of years, right? In an RNA virus, that type of difference can happen, let's say in polio, in a matter of days. And there are some RNA viruses like HIV, which is so difficult to deal with because it's actually not one virus. When it's in somebody's body, it mutates into so many different forms. And that's why there are no good vaccines. One of the reasons why there are no good vaccines for HIV/AIDS is there's actually a million different variants and viruses in somebody's body. So in a sense, while it is a little bit frustrating and difficult to deal with the SARS-CoV-2 variants, I want to tell people and assure them that this is not the worst that it could have been. And there are other viruses that do this. Is perfectly normal.
How many different strains of this virus are there right now? And I mean, there are talks about plenty of them. There's a Brazil variant, there's an India variant, there is some other in Africa, if I'm not mistaken. How many viruses are there right now of this SARS-CoV-2?
Okay, I'm going to answer this in fairly detailed manner, also explaining like how the naming happens. There are various naming mechanisms for this. The most common one is the sort of the Pango, and it's actually like, let's say, B1.1.7 is the one that was first identified in the UK. And that is kind of like an address. Like, so when you see like it's B1.617, and then now there's a .2, that means to get to 6172, that's derived from 617. So these are various lineages. You can basically draw the map out. The first main known lineage was out of Wuhan. And that was the one that was identified in January of last year. And that one is the one that most people know about. Okay, SARS-CoV-2. That was the one that basically all the vaccines, when they got started in February and March and April, the vaccine programs were developed to combat that particular variant, that particular lineage that had jumped and was infecting people. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but there's another variant that came out called D614G, which has one single change in one of the structural components of the spike. So the spike is this protein that basically attaches to a part of the human cell called the ACE2 receptor. And that is the gateway. So that is so much focus has been on that because that is the first step of infection. And so there's one change in that basic structure of that protein that makes that virus able to replicate more, get inside cells better. And because of that, a lot of people don't know this, that lineage actually became predominant sometime in the middle of last year. And so when we talk about like a lot of people say the lineage out of Wuhan, that is actually almost gone. That has been wiped out. The next one that came up was this D614G. Fortunately, though, all the vaccines were working against it. So nobody really paid too much attention to it. Then all of these other variants started to come out. These variants of concern were the first main identified one was the UK variant, the Kent one, which is the 117. But for the sake of clarity, I'm going to, during this talk, just say the variant that came from UK, the variant that came from Brazil is P1, and the variant that came from South Africa is B.1.3.351. So all of these have it. So like we said, mutations are happening all the time. The only ones that we notice, and you'll read about this in the newspapers. Okay, this mutation came, and there was one in the newspaper the other day about one that is in Andhra Pradesh that is causing 15 times more, is 15 times more serious. Absolutely bogus piece of news there. And we'll talk more about like which variants are actually important and which are not. Now, the World Health Organization has noted, those are the variants. All of these variants are ones that have changes to that spike protein that have some potential functional difference that make that virus either more transmissible. So they can do a couple of things. It's either more transmissible in that it spreads better, it replicates better inside cells. So that means the viral load is more, or the clinical characteristics are changed. It could be more severe. So if it gets inside the cells more, or different kinds of cells, and it affects different parts of the body. That's the third thing. And the fourth is around this category of immune escape, in that your prior infection or vaccines created antibodies that don't bind to it because now the shape has changed. And the antibodies that recognized it earlier, they don't. So these are the four basic different categories that can cause these variants. So you can have all kinds of variants and mutations. But I would say the four major ones that we should remember are the ones that you just basically covered. One right now is the one out of the UK, which is definitely more transmissible, at least 50% more transmissible, which means it spreads faster, causes more severe disease. So that's why we're seeing a lot of people have that are younger, that are getting that disease. Fortunately, does not escape the immune system. So that's good. That means prior infection plus vaccines work well against it. So that was the first one that was identified in the UK. And that basically shut down the UK. In the United States, where I'm based now, that B117 is the predominant strain. So now forget about Wuhan. That strain is now gone. That has been outcompeted because this one is more, this is a stronger strain. Out of South Africa came this B1351, which is now the predominant strain there. In Brazil, they are going through a major wave with this P1 strain. And India, we are dealing with in India 2 strains right now. North India, Punjab, and parts of the country have the UK, the strain that came out of the variant that came out of the UK, and also one that was identified in Maharashtra, which was first called the double mutant variant because of 2 changes to a part of that spike. But there are actually more than a dozen changes to it. So it has now been given its formal name, which is the B.1.617. So these are the 4 that I would say right now are the variants of concern. There are many others that are perhaps less concerning. In the future, there will be many more. But each of these, we look at these criteria. Is it more infectious? Does it change the severity of the disease? Can it escape the immune system and cause reinfections? And does it escape vaccines?
Yeah, but what's your comment on the Andhra variant? Because I saw your tweets also on that subject, saying that was pretty bogus in terms of that it's killing much faster and all of the things associated with it. What did you make of that?
Yeah, that was actually the funny thing about that is this is basically a study, even like from the science, and then you mentioned miscommunication. It went through miscommunication and actually even influenced public policy for a little bit. And I'll speak to this. Some report came out. I think it first came out in either the Hindu or somewhere else. And what happened is when that one first information came out, there were a lot of other news organizations that jumped on it. It was a change of one amino acid to another. I think it was an N that got changed to a K. So it's a change to all these letters signify different building blocks of proteins. And so the K is a lysine. It got changed to a lysine at a particular point. And that was the key mutation. First of all, anything that like the first thing that basically the detector goes off, even if you have not read anything that becomes like 10 times or 15 times more deadly is like, that's ridiculous. That's like we're reaching like doomsday scenario type of, because the virus itself is quite scary, right? It doesn't need to get that much more infectious to be able to cause havoc and to be able to spread. It's doing just fine right now. So that was the first aspect of it. And then once I did a little bit of digging, looked at some of the papers and the preprints that were there, This is actually not a new variant. It was identified late last year, and then the proportion of that was actually in decline. So as I mentioned in the last question, if a variant is doing well, then you should see that its proportion is increasing, right? Otherwise, if it vanishes, then the variant is not a variant of concern. It's basically in decline. And that is what was happening. And even the researchers at CCMB in Hyderabad, they said that this is really not, this is going to go away completely. This is not a variant of concern. But the problem around that is the once this was out, not only was it like we have our first ecosystem of our basic news, then we have the second ecosystem of like Twitter and Facebook, and then we have the vast ecosystem of WhatsApp. So whatever you dispel at each level, once it gets to the WhatsApp level, you will see it like for the next few days and for the next few weeks, like it will spread and it like it gets changed at every, it's like gossip, right? It gets changed. And maybe the 15 times when you receive it again, it has become 150 times more deadly or something like that. But the problem around that was at one point, Delhi government decided that they would now impose quarantine and block people from Andhra Pradesh and from Telangana, all based on that false piece of news and that false piece of reporting of science. And even the director of CCMB said, please don't do this. This is not correct.
What's your sort of limited take on the India variants? Like, how would you sort of summarize?
Yeah, I wrote a piece that came out in Hindustan Times for my column. It's going to be out in print, I believe, tomorrow. It basically summarizes everything we know about the variant that came from India, B.1.617. First of all, one thing that we tend to do is like we say, okay, anyone who gets infected in UK is infected with that variant. Anyone who is infected in India is infected with that's not true. To be able to know like what one person is infected with, you actually have to do like some sort of like sequencing or surveillance of there, because multiple variants are competing against each other in the country, right? So we cannot immediately make the assumption that somebody has been infected with that variant. And so this is where this idea of genomic surveillance comes in, where we basically, and the UK has done a fantastic job. India has not done that great of a job. We need to build up capacity where we can actually figure out what percentage of the population is infected with what strain and how it's increasing. So that I would say that would be my general disclaimer about the points I'm making. What we do know so far, and this is actually almost, I would say, hot off the press and hot off the last few days of information, a lot of it does not look good. And I'll get to that part first, the stuff that it doesn't look good. We know it's more transmissible. So of all the criteria that we're like, this is almost confirmed. And this is confirmed because we know that even based on the level is the anecdotal information that we have, that one person in the family is getting infected, entire families are getting infected. Parts of Dharavi that were supposedly at high seronegativity or seropositivity before are getting infected again. So it's spreading like wildfire. We can see this even in the daily numbers. And if we see the rise of this variant, then it's also happening. So it is definitely more infectious, more transmissible. And more recent research has shown this even in cells. Like you can basically take that spike that has all those changes, right? Because ultimately that's the key to the lock of the cell. So you can take the modified key and then see how well it opens. And you don't need to take the original virus because that's a very infectious virus. You can just basically decorate a different kind of virus with that key and see how well it opens. In two cell types, we know that it's more infectious. One of them is unfortunately the lung cell. We know that in certain kinds of cells, so it's more infectious. That is bad news. That means we have to continue to mask up and it's spread by the aerosol route. So that I would say is the first bad news. The second bad news, it's likely more severe. We need more information about this. But what does that mean? That means once it enters the cell, the outcomes, let's say, that were not as severe before, it could be more severe, could be more mortality. We don't know this for sure yet. So now it could be because So there are two possibilities. One is if more people get infected, then you get more severe outcomes. But if you can normalize for the number of infections, if you still see more severe outcomes, that means that it's likely more severe. And that means that it's getting into different kinds of cells more, it's getting into cells more, and it's creating a more immune response in people. And that's why. So it's likely more infectious, it's likely more severe. The third point is, what about reinfections? This was like a big concern, like people who have been infected before, what's happening here? And here the immune system is such that you can do these tests to see antibodies of people who had been infected before and see that. So there's a 50% drop in antibody recognition of people who had been infected. Well, this preprint is just out a few days. 50%, put that in context, is actually not that bad. It's reasonably good. So that means that you have pretty good protection. If you were infected by a previous variant a few months ago, then you are likely protected. And the last one, which I know is the big focus that and we'll talk about that, is like, how do the vaccines work? Preliminary work shows that the vaccines have reduced effectiveness in terms of the antibodies. Again, like sometimes it's like a 60% drop, sometimes it's a different drop, but that is still enough to offer some protection, and we're not seeing that much severe disease and death. So the broad conclusion is it's more infectious, it causes more severe disease, may cause some more reinfections, but vaccines still work. They work to prevent severe disease and they work to prevent death. So we know quite a bit about the India strain already. We'll know more in coming days.
Can you talk about the efficacy of the vaccines that are there in India? So there's one Covaxin from Bharat Biotech, then there's this AstraZeneca version that Serum has produced, COVID Shield, and now I think Sputnik has also arrived in India. I mean, the efficacy of these vaccines, what you can say about that?
First of all, the Covaxin data is still fairly incomplete. And we know this because they've only put out the interim data, and some of it has come in the form of a press release and some in preprints. We are still awaiting the final data. So after you have so the way the efficacy is done is you take a certain number of people, let's say 20,000 people on one side, and then you take 20,000 people on the other, and they don't know that it's randomized. 20,000 people per, or say half of the group, they receive the vaccine, half of the group, they receive a placebo, and then they go about their daily business, and you count up the infections. Once you receive a number of positive infections, whatever your time endpoint is, it could be infections, it could be mild COVID-19, it could be severe. Whatever you decide before the experiment, that's going to be it. Let's say you got 150, then you see how many of those 150 that you have counted up were in the vaccine group and how many were in the placebo group. So those 150 must have accrued, or whatever that number must have accrued for Covaxin right now, but we don't have those final results. The reason that would be very, very interesting, as you can probably imagine, is because we have this variant right now in India. With that variant, what you would get is like some real world data from the clinical trials, right? How, what is the efficacy against that? Because people would be getting the vaccine and then they would be exposed to the variant that is in India. So I'm very, very interested in that piece of data that we have. And we don't have that yet. The interim data, I think, is above somewhere around 80%, but I would definitely take that with a pinch of salt right now. AstraZeneca numbers have been all over the place. And I know that I'm saying this is probably confusing for everyone else as well, because there was the whole deal with a half dose, full dose. Then there was the deal with various clinical trials of like 4-week gap. Then there was like a 6-week gap.
Yeah.
And then there's like this 12-week gap. And then, so what is it counted against? It's counted against basically, and then there are different places like the vaccine did not do well in South Africa against the South Africa variant. It did reasonably well in the US. And the bridging trial in India was a very small bridging trial. So I would say that the numbers are basically the efficacy against mild to moderate disease is about 70 to 80%, depending on the parameters, after two doses, after both doses have been administered. But it's very hard to make sense of like, and I don't think you need to focus on that too much as well, because on a personal level, it doesn't matter if something is 70% or something is 80%, right? Because that's not your own, that's not your personal absolute risk. That's the data from the trial. What I will say is the good news is that it does prevent severe disease. So in all of the trials where it's been tested, barring the South Africa, it's about 85% to 100% in preventing severe disease after two doses.
Any news about the Sputnik one?
The Sputnik one came out with the first two doses, and it looked very, very good with a 90% plus efficacy, and that was published in the Lancet. So they did their phase 2 and then their phase 3 in the Lancet. They also introduced something called a Sputnik Light, I believe, which is a one dose, but it's basically just the first dose of the 2-dose vaccine. And that's a different kind of an adenovirus vector vaccine that they have. In the last 24 to 48 hours, there have been some questions that have come up regarding how those trials were run and the transparency. This is after some concerns from Brazil. So my short take would be it works. It probably works really, really well. And the efficacy numbers look really, really good. Some people are now doubting how good those efficacy numbers are, but it seems to work. The vaccine works.
I mean, obviously they have been tested against some of the strains that are there are across the world right now. But how effective will these vaccines will be in the face of new variants that are like kind of creeping up as we go? And to deal with the incoming strains or mutants, how do we go forward towards that? How do we achieve that?
Yeah, this is a sort of a two-pronged and very interesting question. To answer this, let me talk about immunity first as like, what is it? What it is? It is more of, if you could create a rubric, I know your audience is very sophisticated, but it's basically a sliding scale. Okay, so it's a sliding scale of, when we think about immunity, we think about like somebody not getting sick. But if we think about like from one side, on one hand, first we have like, okay, somebody is not getting infected, they are not transmitting the disease. And that's the first to go, usually. That's usually mediated by neutralizing antibodies. They have to act fairly early in like in the upper part of the respiratory tract to be able to prevent somebody from getting infected. The second part of that, if we're going down that gradient, the second part is, okay, somebody got infected and is transmitting the disease. So it's now transmitting. We go down a little bit further. Now they got COVID-19, but it's mild. Going down further, it's like, okay, it's moderate disease, still manageable. Maybe they need oxygen. Then you're going to severe disease, critical disease, where they have to be hospitalized. They have to go to the ICU. And then obviously the worst is death. And then from a prevention perspective, obviously you want to start from that end. You want to prevent death and you want to go in that direction. All of the vaccines that we know are very good at preventing death, are very good at preventing severe disease and keeping people out of. This is a general statement we can make. I think a lot of us get confused because then we go into the efficacy numbers and, okay, this vaccine is better. And people are thinking of it like, okay, should I get the mRNA vaccine and wait for this or do this or that? All of the vaccines are good at this. Over time, and they create what is called a polyclonal reaction, in that they're not actually hitting one part, they're hitting many parts of that spike. So right now, against the variants that we have, the vaccines are good to different extents in preventing infection, very good at preventing death. And then you see like this mosaic in the middle against the different variants. Like, for example, we know the AstraZeneca Covishield vaccine is not good at all against the South Africa variant in preventing mild to moderate disease or infections. So basically, that was one that I would say, maybe it sounds harsh, but it kind of failed against that immunity. And that is the hardest one to deal with in terms of the B1351 South Africa variant and the variant out of Brazil. As I said before, fortunately, the variant in India is not to that extent with respect to those vaccines. So AstraZeneca didn't work well against that. So you might have seen some news recently, like from South Africa or the island of Seychelles, where a lot of people have been vaccinated, but they're still getting infected. And the thing is, they got vaccinated with Covishield AstraZeneca, but the strain is the South Africa strain. So it's not protecting them from infection. It's protecting them from going to the hospital and dying, which is good, but they're still getting infected. So this is where we're at right now. Ultimately, the problem is what we started this discussion with is that these variants are continuing to mutate. And so you're starting with the background of the variants now, and they're going to continue to mutate. And so at some point, it's going to happen that more of these are going to be able to escape. And so the question then becomes like, will we need booster shots of these? Like if you add the same, and that's one of the things that is being looked at, is if you add like maybe a third dose of the same vaccine, it raises the antibody level up so it can recognize it. Or maybe it's a booster shot of a slightly modified vaccine that now recognizes the mix of the variants. And the third thing that's also being looked at is mixing up these vaccines. So let's say if you got the Covaxin or Covishield, your third dose is going to be either an mRNA from Pfizer or a Moderna. We're going to mix it up. Or if you got an mRNA, then that creates sort of a different kind of, it's a mixture of an immune response that you get. So that's what the current status is looking like and what the future is looking like. At some point, it's going to start to creep away. But again, to go back to that initial point, it will still prevent against severe disease.
Right.
Okay, let's take some questions from people.
I think we have already taken Megha's question. Saurabh is asking, when will a vaccine likely to be out for children aged 3 and 5 years old? So basically the question is, when will the vaccines come out for children?
I have an additional question. Will that be needed for children?
These are both good questions. So there are, to my knowledge, there are 4 trials underway in children right now. Actually 3, because one has been halted, and I'll get to that. The mRNA vaccines are undergoing trials. The Pfizer one, just in the United States, just got approved and is now being actually given to kids the age of 12 to 15 onwards. There is a trial for kids 6 months and older with both the Moderna, and there's also a Pfizer trial for young children, school-going kids as well. AstraZeneca started a trial for kids for their vaccine, but that has now been halted because of the rare blood clot issue that has been found. That's, again, it's very, very rare. But that also gets to the question that Ashish was asking, is like, is that actually needed if they have more mild disease, or if it's sort of not causing these severe forms of disease? And what they did was they did a risk-reward balance, right? And they saw and thought that, yes, the blood clots are rare, but in kids, the fatalities with that virus are also extremely, extremely rare. And kids going to clinical wards is also rare. So perhaps we don't give them that vaccine. We consider other vaccines for them. And I also heard very recently about Covaxin going into trials, a very small trial in children as well. So these are all underway. And I hope by the end of this summer, there will be more. I think Pfizer is definitely the fastest out of the gate. But yeah, these are the ones that I'm aware of.
Manan Vora has a question: issues of sequencing not being done enough and how it can cause issues. Would you like to address that?
Yeah, so the thing is, we are identifying variants, but though they're being identified through sequencing, if you don't do sequencing, then you don't identify variants, then you don't know what you're dealing with. So that's basically the thing, is you are, a lot of it is becomes empirical and basically guesswork and blindness as to what is happening. And you can't take appropriate measures. All the things that I mentioned, we know this because we know the strain, and everything starts from there. And then we can know if it's more transmissible, if it works against vaccines, if it's more serious disease. But otherwise, you don't know what you're up against. So you have to sequence more people to know what's spreading more and what's causing more severe disease.
Okay. So it seems that during the second wave in India, the positivity rate and the mortality rate have all been, both are significantly higher than the first wave in last year. Also, while the infection was mostly in the elderly people last year, it seems to be affecting more younger people this time around. Uh, is it really because of a mutation, or is it for any other different reason? What do you think?
Well, we don't know that. This is going back to what I was saying about we need more and better epidemiological data, because if more people are infected, then obviously more younger people as a number will. So you need both the numerator and the denominator, right, to be able to do this calculation. And if you don't have both, you can't do that. But the other point about this is that, as I mentioned, initial data is suggesting that the variant that came out of India, B.1.617, probably does cause more severe disease. And that's why we're seeing more severe disease and more severe outcomes. It is a worse form of the virus. So the answer is we don't know, but it's probably a mix of multiple factors.
Right.
There's one of these questions where the question is whether the virus is airborne. And what's the second part of that? What precautions to take?
Yes, the virus is absolutely airborne, and this is not anything new, or it's been known since early last year. It's mentioned in my book, and my book was published even before everyone is mentioning this new guidelines article in Lancet.
Yeah, right.
But my book was published even before that, and I've mentioned that as well. The precautions are exactly the same as you would take otherwise, with some additional safeguards. Like obviously you want to wear masks that are better and tighter fitting. In certain situations, you want to wear 2 masks if possible. Airborne means you want to ventilate more as well, and make sure that the air is being cleaned and circulated well. If you're in a closed setting, if there is a HEPA filter, those seem to work really, really well in terms of clearing it out as well. But yeah, I mean, I think the precautions are exactly the same. Airborne means it's still getting diffused over space. It doesn't mean that it's staying as a blob and still concentrated. That's why everyone is making the big deal about outdoors and ventilation, because there's so much air outside that even if somebody is sick outside and coughing these viruses out, it's getting diluted in the air outside.
Got it. Pradip. Oh.
Yeah. So by the looks of it, a third wave looks inevitable, right? So what are the precautions that one can take? We don't know how severe it would be or whatever. People are still iffy about vaccinations. There are not enough vaccinations in this country right now. So in the face of a third wave coming, and I also say this because Lancet has recently done a study which after which they have said that close to or maybe 1 million people will die by August in India due to the virus.
This was there are a couple of modeling groups. There's one at the University of Washington that said yes, absolutely, by the end of July, 1st of August, close to 1 million people will die in India. There are a couple of people modeling who said perhaps even 1 million people have already died, and they're basing this off of the cremations and all of these.
Correct.
Again, these are all indirect models. And some other people what they will look at is the excess deaths, the total number of deaths this year versus last year, and extrapolate that. Yeah, sorry, I cut your question off.
So yeah, so what is it that we can do to safeguard ourselves? What is the precautions that we can take, right?
Okay, so do you want me to answer this on a
I,
personal level
that's,
or on
that's what I
a
was saying.
national?
By you mean you, Pradeep, or you mean the government of India?
Yeah, this is because that's very, very different. I think on a personal level and then on a policy level, it would be different.
Well, I would like to know your point of view. I do kind of know what the government of India would say anyway. So yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I know the vaccination is a problem, but definitely get vaccinated. I think that is the single biggest thing that you can do to not just for peace of mind, but as I mentioned, like most of our talk, I was the one silver lining I would say of all of the things that we discussed is the vaccines are working, regardless of what you hear. Okay, so to put this into perspective, we are hearing about people who are vaccinated with 2 shots who are getting sick. Some of them are tragically dying. This is truth. We cannot move away from that. But this is also, and this is news, as it should be. But this is like hearing about the plane that crashed and not the planes that landed, right? So we
Right.
don't have those numbers. By and large, the planes are landing. By and large, the vaccines are effective and working. So definitely get vaccinated. I would say that's number one. And then the other thing I would say is that if you're not infected, then continue to maintain the measures. This was a rude awakening for everyone. On the government level, you and I and everyone else knows what has to happen is that we basically you cannot start to scale up in the middle of a wave. You have to be prepared before it, right? You have to have the ICU beds, you have to have the ventilators, you have to have the oxygen, and in the middle of a wave, especially a wave of that sort of amplitude, there's not much you can do.
Right.
I'll take a couple of questions. This is one question where, this person is asking for a clarification whether breastfeeding mothers can take the vaccine or not, and if there's any trial going on this one.
Yes, there is. There are trials, and there is no solid guidance yet, as far as I'm aware, from India's health ministry. The US CDC has actually left it as a personal decision for the mothers to make up their mind. There are other trials. Israel, on the other hand, has actually recommended pregnant and breastfeeding mothers to get the vaccine. And what happens is that the antibodies do get transferred. So it does give some protection to the child as well.
Is it? I wanted to ask you, is it? I mean, do vaccinated people shed a lot of viruses?
No, they should not. And early on, it was like, okay, everyone has to, even if they get infected, everyone has to wear masks. Some of these vaccines, the ones that we have most data on yet, say that they actually reduce transmission by quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And especially the mRNA vaccines, they're very good at even reducing the infectiousness and the transmission. There is some data on the AstraZeneca, which is the equivalent of Covishield as well, that it's reasonably good in cutting down infections. And you have the real world data from the UK as well, because they relied on 2 vaccines. They relied on the Pfizer vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine to be, and they also had lockdowns, but they used all of this to be able to cut down the total number of infections and beat their own wave. So yes.
Go on, Ashish.
No, yeah.
So quite a few questions, and we have limited time left. So let's run through the questions one by one. Can you pick them?
I think we have answered a lot of these questions during the course of this talk. One question that is coming up again and again is the duration that should be between the first and the second dose of the vaccine. I mean, we have discussed about it, but can you shed more light on it, since everybody seems to be confused about the duration between the 2 vaccines, the government also changing goalposts and everything around it?
Yeah, the government just immediately, I got about 20 questions and about 20 tweets asking me like about
Yes.
the 12-week and increasing it beyond 12 weeks. This is all like absolutely breaking news right now. All of the clinical trials were done with. So now we're just talking about AstraZeneca Covishield.
That's right.
Because Covaxin is like, we don't even have the basic
Yeah.
phase 3 data for that yet. So that becomes complete conjecture. This trial was done, the clinical trials were done with 4 weeks. And so when it started, a few people, let's say such as my mother and others, they were able to get their first dose and the second dose within the 4 weeks. Then they expanded it to 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, which was also based on some real world data. And now it's 12 weeks. The 12 weeks is actually based on information in the UK, where the UK wanted to get everyone or as many people with one shot first with partial protection, and then to observe how long that protection would rise over time before giving the second dose. And a paper came out in the Lancet that pooled a couple of studies and actually showed that between that gap, although there may be some limited protection, like the drop off in protection, but over time, because of the way the immune response ramps up, it ramps up over time, that expanding that duration doesn't cause a detrimental effect. And in a situation of scarcity, which is what India is facing right now with vaccines, maybe the approach is to give everyone one dose, wait for 12 weeks, and then give them the second dose. In terms of efficacy, if people can stay safe between that time period, there's not much of a drop off. And the controversial bit of it is they're suggesting that it may actually be more higher efficacy. Some people buy that, some people don't, but I think overall it is based on science.
No, but do you think it will work against the Indian variant? Because there's no real data for that, right?
The only data, yeah, exactly. The only data for that, and I thought about this just as I was having my coffee in the morning. The only data for that is what I mentioned, is there's a 50% drop off in the number of antibodies. So let's say that whatever we have, 50% less, or maybe not even 50%. That's actually not fair to say, because there are a lot more antibodies than that. So even with a 50% drop off, the real world significance is not going to be 50%. I think it's a fairly, we can't say this about all the decisions, but this one is fairly rooted in science.
Got it.
Sorry, I was thinking it through in my head as I was saying it.
Yeah, no. See, my skepticism comes from that most of the decisions in the policy front has been fairly, shot from the hips sort of thing. And
opaque. Like there's no reasoning behind it. It's just basically, and I agree with you, because there was no clarity on why it was 4 weeks and then why it went to 6 weeks and why it went. Even now we are basically guessing why. I'm just telling you what the science is. I don't know if that's actually driving the reasoning, or if it's just completely, there's a scarcity, we don't have vaccines, that's why we're doing this.
Got it. Yeah, this is clear.
A similar question, right? India has approved like protocols for ivermectin and HCQ, highly questionable treatments for COVID, even as other countries are saying no to them, both of them. Do we have any successful treatments at all other than steroids or vaccination for prevention?
Well, steroids won't work for prevention at all. And we are awash in drugs right now. Some doctors are sharing the prescriptions of many drugs. In most people, COVID-19 is a self-limiting disease. Basically, the outcomes are not, it's not pleasant, but most people will recover on their own without the use of any drugs whatsoever. They won't need anything apart from perhaps paracetamol, and even now ibuprofen has been shown to be safe, to be able to be used over a couple of weeks, and then drinking lots of fluids. They don't actually need anything. So how much of it is needs driven and how much of it is very serious patients and they are getting desperate, and I'm very sensitive to that as well. If you are seeing someone in a very serious case, then you don't think about the clinical trials at the moment. Remdesivir is an antiviral. It supposedly works very early on in the infection, but it's also an infusion drug, right? So you can't give it to somebody early. Only time they're getting is after they've been hospitalized, and by that time it may not work as well. Steroids are being given, like, because they're so cheap, they're being given to everyone. and that's now causing this mucormycosis, this rare fungal disease to
Black
appear.
fungus. Yeah.
Yes, this black fungus to appear in people, because what that does, the steroids do is they actually dampen your immune system and your inflammation. So if your immune system is working well on its own to be able to clear the virus, why would you take steroids? You don't need steroids. Only people who need steroids are those whose own immune systems are acting against them and causing these types of problems and chest congestion and lack of oxygen. So I don't think there's this understanding of why the drug is being. The other one is antibiotics. Why are antibiotics being given? The antibiotics are against bacterial infections.
Yeah.
The number of bacterial co-infections with SARS-CoV-2, there's a paper about this, is about 10%. So 1 out of 10. But if you look at any prescription, everyone has azithromycin, starting from A to Z, all the antibiotics. All of these are, and then the biggest one obviously is plasma, convalescent plasma, which there are a lot of requests for, but multiple trials. There are some very small and weakly powered trials that show it might have some benefit in some people, but it's like being used as a massive scale. And as I wrote in a piece in Mint, convalescent plasma in certain people might actually be giving rise to some of the variants. It's not helping and it's causing problems. So yeah, I mean, I think there is a tendency in general in our country to overprescribe, because we tend to think of a doctor who gives a lot of things as a better doctor than a doctor who listens and says, okay, what do you need to do? And I'm just telling you to get some bed rest and check your oxygen. I mean, nobody goes to that doctor. We measure the doctor by the number of drugs that they prescribe.
Yeah. Prince, my colleague has a question. Is it right that children will be at a higher risk in the third wave? And why so?
Yeah, this was actually phrased slightly weirdly, and I took objection to that. If a large number of elderly people and older people are vaccinated, then what you're going to see is you're going to see a shift of the people who are getting infected. And this has happened. Particularly in the US, what we're seeing now is because 60% of the people, of adults, have received either one shot, 30% have received both shots. So now we're seeing a shift of this. So who are the people who are getting infected now? People who are anti-vaxxers and basically will not get vaccinated. And then it's shifting more towards children. So we're seeing, but that doesn't mean the absolute number of infections in children is increasing. No, I think that's where people are making the mistake. They're saying, okay, this is now, and they're thinking that it's the same, it's not the same epidemic peak. It's not the same number of people who are infected before and the same number of children. It's fewer children, proportion of children infected is higher.
Got it. Guys, we've almost finished and crossed our time by even 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So if there's any last question, we'll sort of wrap up with that. You can just go through the chat and the Q&A box and see.
Yeah, I don't think any of the other questions in the Q&A box is left. I want to get to this one. This is interesting, right? How long before we start talking about side effects of vaccines, these vaccines? Because I mean,
we are talking about them.
Data so far. So yeah.
We are talking about side effects of vaccines. I don't think we were looking at them and talking about them during the clinical trials. I think a lot of people are not taking the vaccines because they are worried about the side effects of them. And I can talk about my personal experience, and my wife got hers yesterday, and it's just the second dose basically knocked both of us out. So there are side effects. These are the general side effects, though, of the immune system actually mounting a strong response. And then the other side effects that have come up, the rare blood clots, and they are being discussed, and in certain countries that it has been paused. So I think, and even J&J was paused while they looked at the data.
That should be it. I think I don't have any more questions unless Ashish has something else.
No, I guess most of the things are covered.
Yes.
Anirban, if you think that we've missed out anything and something that people should be sort of, or something that we've sort of not covered, just chime in, please. All right. Pradeep, overs for you to close. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much for this, Anirban. I know it's really early, and we'd let you go to your coffee, go back to your coffee and work. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Been a great session. I hope everybody learned a thing or two from this. Have a good evening, everyone, and stay safe. Bye.
Yeah.